Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Got Will here today. We have one pre-submitted question I'm trying to dig up here. Will, you can hear me okay, right? And you can see the Lunch and Learn slides. Can you confirm? Oh, good Lord. Where are my pre-submitted questions? Oh, we do have a pre-submitted question from Chris, excuse me. Excuse me. Here we go. Let me get all my stuff in order. Fireflies.ai note taker? What in the heck is that? Get out of here, AI thing.
Machines are taking over.
Yeah, right. All right. How can we send events without cross-project dependencies? Plan, create entity in a common project. To publish event, save a new record. Listener project has entity configuration extension for this entity with its own after save flow. Ooh, I'm not sure I follow that exactly. Can you try to restate that for me?
Yeah, I had a more verbose explanation, but the form didn't really accept it.
Okay.
So the basic idea is I have about a half dozen projects, and I'm sort of seeing that there's a need that if one, that there may be a need to say sort of publish what I'll call an event, and that these projects will independently listen to the events and decide to either act on them or not.
Right.
So the problem is I can't have one project calling a flow from another project, which would be sort of the usual way. Okay, what do I do about this little event, as it were? I'll call this flow, then that flow, then that flow, right? But that would create cross-project dependencies that we're trying to avoid. So it should be run that flow if that flow is here, kind of a thing, meaning it's been installed. So that's what I mean by a cross-project dependency. I can't have project A fail because it tried to fail, because we forced the install, and it's trying to call a flow in project B, but project B is not yet installed. See what I'm driving at?
Right.
But one thing that we do is that we have what I'll call common project, which is where we put shared things like some of the utility flows that you don't want to recode over and over again. So the plan here would be, well, let's just create a new data structure in this common project. So everybody can, consume that data structure directly. There's not going to be a problem because as part of what we do, we always guarantee that common gets installed, gets updated first, and then everything afterwards. So the thinking here is, well, I could use, one of these entity configuration extensions on this like message entity. And in particular, what's caught my eye is the after save flow. So my thinking is that each project would naturally have its own after save flow triggered by simply saving one of those records.
So this entity would have X number of after save flows that run depending on the number of projects that need to be. This is some kind of like publishing type property or thing, right? Like,
right.
If entity A is updated, update projects XYZ. So you're like sending an event or something to something in those projects?
Well, those projects, XYZ, have their own extension of the entity where they have their own after save flow. So the idea would be that if it's installed, it brought with it its own extension of that entity, which means that anytime anybody saves that entity, all of them, their after save flows should trigger.
Oh, so each project would have its own configuration extension for this object.
Right. How much trouble am I creating here?
that might get really hairy. Like in a world where like you might be trying to figure out like say an action visibility rule behaving oddly for this object, right? Like you could put that and the same, you could have a variety of action visibility rules running across multiple configuration folders.
Yeah,
Why
that would be, and that would be something that we're not going to be doing.
Why can't it, why not just make it part of the common project? What, does that not alleviate any of your concerns? Like the common project always gets updated first on deployment or something?
So, but how does the common project trigger a flow in another project without creating a circular dependency?
Oh, so you need a common project to call a flow.
I mean, we're sort of, this is where indirection is kind of what we're driving at, is what we're really driving into here. Indirect run of another flow.
So we have a customer, they use REST services to try to delink these things and turn each project into a bit of a microservice. Each they wouldn't call the flow directly. They'd call the other flow as just an API endpoint. So they wouldn't need to know about the flow. They would just make a REST call. That REST call would just happen to resolve into another decisions flow in a different project. So they kind of hooked into other projects used by leveraging the ability to call a flow as a REST service. That might be something to think through. You know, common project just knows to make an API call to a particular endpoint. Though I guess that does imply that the flow already exists. You might think about, I'm assuming there's commonality in terms of inputs here. You could also look at using runtime selection in some way, where you runtime select to find the right flow instead of it being hard coded in the design itself.
Runtime select, you kind of lost me at that point.
Yeah.
Are you talking like,
go ahead.
Would this be something like a string match step that then changes over to other things?
Yeah, like technically each subflow gets called gets called live every time it gets executed. And so on a subflow, you can specify to do runtime select, and you'll get a new input called target ID. What's today? 7/17. Because copying a subflow doesn't actually into an apparent flow doesn't actually copy the contents of the subflow. It's still called by reference. So if we created a subflow here, by default, right? By default, the ID is bound. The ID of the flow to call, as well as its input and output definitions, are now bound to the parent, but none of its content. If you click on advanced here, you'll see your selection type is pick, but you have runtime selection. So if you feed a flow ID into target ID, this subflow will run the flow ID that you've given it. And you can do this with all sorts of other different element registration objects and decisions. And so an example could be you have a truth table, and maybe this diagram helps. Like here's a truth table. You know, you do some logic lookup. Maybe you have an entity that gets deployed with your projects, like an actual, not a data type itself, but like a record of a data type. Like you create like a master lookup table, and each project has a deployment, has part of its deployment package, like a particular entity that owns the flow ID of the flow that's supposed to be called. And then you could have a harness that says like, whenever I call this particular flow that has cross project context, look up the ID of the flow in project A, then pass it into the subflow step. In that way that the project A's version of the flow will get called, and so on and so forth for the different projects themselves. That way, maybe the shared project has the data type itself. So like the entity definition, and each of the other projects owns a specific entity or entities that owns that definition, that like the actual values. That might, and then you're using those in runtime select. That might be a way to do. I'm just brainstorming out loud here, but that might be a way to do what you're talking about here. Excuse me.
Yeah, one of the ideas that I kicked around a little bit before I thought about, well, I didn't really know about the runtime selection, so I kind of thought that my own ideas of how to get, start with the idea of a flow and then call it, struck me as sort of doing things sort of in the background that probably are unfortunate.
Mhm.
But one of the ideas I had at that point was to actually do basically a query on, can I find flows in EDI header data
Mhm.
that have a particular tag on them? The idea would
Mhm.
be those projects would carry that tag with that flow.
Yes, you could do
And
that.
then
Sure.
that would get me a list of flow IDs, and then I could just go
Mhm.
around and call each one.
That would, yeah, that's a similar approach here. Yeah, runtime select would be assuming a standardization of inputs and outputs would work really gracefully, because you
And
wouldn't
that,
need to do like a string match spider web. You could have it be like have it. You wouldn't need to design a subflow step in the main flow for each subflow to be called or something. I'm not sure that description made much sense.
well, and I think that's where the what I call like the message entity comes into play then, is that they would all accept the message entity as their only
Hmm.
input. And since that is sort of, if it's a word, the common
Hmm.
thing, then here's your message, have a nice day.
Yeah, do whatever you want with it. That's right. Yep. And it can be that what it does with it can be completely unique to each project.
Right.
So yeah, I think runtime select probably is something that you might run down as you're sort of sketching this out more. It sounds less of a management nightmare than multiple configuration folders and after save flows.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of thought that would get me the indirect linking, but I also thought it's inviting trouble.
I think so. Yeah.
All right, that
Cool. Yeah.
that answers the essential question.
You bet. Let me jump to another question, and if you've got any other follow-up thoughts here, let me know.
All right,
All
thanks.
right. Yeah. Thanks, guys. All right, Sean. I'm trying to make a user action, particularly towards an admin user action, but I don't know how to properly make one. Can you let me know what you mean by that?
Sure. Oh, hi, by the way. So the issue I'm having is I'm trying to make in particular, it's an edit action. So once the user actually submits data, I can then have only admins will be able to say edit
Okay.
certain data.
Sure.
And I'm trying to, I guess, I'm basically just trying to build that, but I've never actually built one before, and I'm not exactly sure where to even start per se.
Well, the first thing you want to look up is entity action visibility. And this is how you're going to be able to restrict this edit action you're going to create to just admin users, right? In the configuration folder for the data type you're working with, you're going to get the ability to create an action visibility rule. Here you can see we're inside, there's this person information object folder here, and
Yes.
we're inside of a folder called entity action. Action, when is this screenshot? Let me, this is a, oh, good Lord. Let me just create this really quick so we can look at my example. I'm not sure what that screenshot's trying to show. I'm going to create like an entity for it really quickly. Here's an entity, test entity one, some garbage property for a property. And then inside, so now with this thing. You're going to create an entity act. So this is your data type, right? And you're going to go to user action and create a user action, right? Called user action flow 1.
Yeah.
And then this thing is going to do whatever you need your flow to do, right? Fetch and show a form and so on and so forth. This action shows up everywhere where that entity shows up at, right?
Right.
And then you can come and do an action visibility rule, which will allow you to write a rule to restrict that to users who are administrators only. And this document should kind of show a bit of that. So this hides an action by create insurance claim. And then you can see, yeah, they're using flow data initiating account, but you could also do initiating user group list. So inside of here, you might look at flow data initiating user groups, right? And then you can say like list contains, list contains, and then administrators. And this way you can only show an action to someone who's an administrator. Again, I don't know. And that way this and then you have to add the action name too though, right? So you'd say action name equals, your specific, edit the thing action, right?
Right.
And if you do that, then then that action can only show in their context menu if the user who's right clicking on it is an administrator.
Okay.
And then you get that set up, and then all the work is just in your user, in the entity action flow. You've got two. You can do a single or a group. Like it either deals with a collection or a single, depending on your particular the thing that you're doing.
I think this one, it would just be a single. As far as the actual, I guess, editing part. So my understanding is that you would involve a mapping step. Well, I guess you would first put in would you put in a rule? Would the action visibility rule be the first thing that you would put into the edit action, and then you would go, if it passes the rule, then you would go through the rest of the flow, and if it fails, then you would just go to the end of the flow. Do I have that right so far, or?
No, I mean, the action visibility rule isn't part of your flow at all.
It's not part of the
its job is just to allow that action to show up or not.
Oh, okay.
If you need additional behavior in the flow itself, you can code that, right?
Okay.
But the action visibility rule just controls if it shows up or not in the context menu. The entity action flow itself handles all of the actual logic of the interaction.
Okay, I see. Okay, got that. So I guess in the actual action then, if I wanted to have it, I guess, edit a flow as opposed to just doing the entire flow again. So if there is a certain bit of data in that I would want to edit, how would I go about making a user action that will allow me to edit that bit of data?
Well, the entity action gives you that data object as an input by default, right? Like if you look in the entity action flow, you'll get some default inputs for that object. So like in here, in user action flow, if you look at Data Explorer, it gives us a thing called entity, but that entity is our test entity 1, and it has access to all the properties. So I could show any of these properties on a form, right? And then, go ahead.
Oh, no, keep going.
And then I could do like a change value mapping and something like save entities if I needed to update something. So imagine here, I got like a form. On this form, I'm going to show a bunch of stuff, whatever the properties that I want to allow a user to edit after it's been created, right? And then maybe like, here's like a text box for my property name. And then what can happen is here, your input would be, entity, that garbage text property I created. And then I could change the value of that. I go into entity, garbage text, whatever. I should have picked a better property name. And then I can just save that whole thing in like a save entity step. So there's my test entity, and I can pass in entity. And that'll go ahead and configure, that'll go ahead and let me update the object itself when when and if a user changes something on this form.
Okay, so
the
It
general
would,
pattern you're looking for.
okay, so it would just be, so that form right there would be the form that is submitted for the actual, that is actually submitted, right? So,
This is the
so,
form that would be presented to a user when they right-click the object you're talking about
yeah,
and select the entity action flow that you're building.
I see. So it would now would it actually populate, I guess, each of the fields based off the request?
Yes, I mean, because you're
Okay.
mapping in, like, you get this data for free, right? Like it's giving you, that input is for free. It's bound to the data type that it's a part of. So if I added one of these things, here's test entity 1. I'll just put a bunch of Fs, right? Here's test entity 1. If I right click, I get user action flow 1. If I click that, it's going to give me that. And then I can click B, right? And I could do the same thing and it'll be B now, so on and so forth. So yes, it is connected to the data type you created. So the data from the data type comes to it for free. You don't have to fetch it or find it or filter it down in any way.
Right. Okay. So okay. So I see. I was under the impression that it was multiple steps, and you have to first map it in order to populate the form, and then after you populate the form, then you have to map it again in order to save the changes that you did, and then from there, that would be then it would, and you would have to save it to like the actual data folder, so you would have to get the actual ID for it. But if it's just a simple two-step process of form, save entity, and that's an entire edit action, then
yeah, correct. Because you're using an entity action flow that knows the thing it's being, like, this only shows you actions for test entity 1, right? It doesn't
right.
show you actions for anything else. So you get that input for free. You don't have to find it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was my question. So thank you very much, Will. I appreciate it.
You bet. All right. Anybody else have any other questions today? Okay. All right. I think that's everything. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. We will see you same time tomorrow.